It's been nearly a week now since President Barack Obama took the podium and addressed the joint session of Congress, and 225 years since George Washington did the same for the State of the Union address. Critics and supporters alike have had ample time now to break down the speech, pull out the talking points, and read between the lines. One of them is Matthew Ho. He's a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. His latest article is titled "Presidential War Lies, Standing Ovations, and the Great Waste of Everything." It's a pretty sharp indictment of the president's speech, a speech that attempted to put a silver lining on unemployment, foreign oil, and the war in Afghanistan, among other things. Matthew joins us now via Skype from his office in Raleigh, North Carolina. Matthew, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Matthew, let's jump into this right away. The president opened his speech declaring our combat mission in Afghanistan is over. This reminds me of that famous picture of George Bush on the aircraft carrier with a banner in the background saying "Mission Accomplished." Is there any difference here?
No, there's really not. I mean, the theatrics and the absurdity is not there of President Bush's, that fiasco on the deck of the aircraft carrier. But make no mistake, the sentiment is still there. This notion that somehow what our troops have paid for in their own blood and the blood of both Iraqis and Afghans was somehow worth it, or somehow justified, or somehow accomplished something that is a benefit to the United States of America is entirely lost in the reality. So it is very much similar, though President Obama, again, didn't go to that absurd length of landing a plane on an aircraft carrier. He has, culminating in the State of the Union address, continued to emphasize how our combat in Afghanistan has made us safer, that Afghanistan is a better place because of our occupation, and in his words, the war is over, which of course for our troops who've served there, so many of them dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injuries, motor injury, as well as too for the Afghan people, the war is certainly not over.
Yeah, I want to get into the cost of war in just a minute, but Obama stated that the troop count in Afghanistan is 15,000, a drawdown of 165,000 from 6 years ago. Yet at the end of last year, the House approved the United States to arm Syrian rebels, and then just a few days ago, a U.S.-led force launched 26 airstrikes against ISIS. What do you make of these actions? Are we simply shifting our military to another region in the Middle East?
I think so, and this has been described for years as a whack-a-mole strategy where we just chase different enemies, some real, some ghosts, many of them, or most of them, of our own creation, say particularly Al-Qaeda because of our part in the war against the Soviets in the 1980s, and the Islamic State, which of course grew out of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which didn't exist until we invaded Iraq. But yes, we do. We see ourselves bouncing from one location to another. The president has bombed 7 different countries in the Middle East in his 6 years in office, and there doesn't seem to be any let-up. Nowhere does it gets better. And I think that the height of this is most recently seen in Yemen, where a few months ago, where the president was announcing how his policy of bombing now again in Iraq and bombing now in Syria was justified because of the successes that we had seen in our strategy in Yemen. Well, a few short months later, the government in Yemen collapses and the country is in a state of chaos.
Well, now Obama, during that same speech, he called out the American people or Congress for making rash decisions based on headlines that draw us into conflicts. Has he demonstrated that same behavior?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. I mean, you saw amazingly in 2013 when there was that chemical weapons attack in Syria that killed hundreds of people. The president wanted to go to war in Syria to attack the Assad government. He was rushing into it. This year, when the Islamic State exploded an international presence in terms of international notoriety in Iraq, even though the Iraqi people have been dealing with them, as well as the Syrian people have been dealing with them for many, many years now. He wanted to go to war in Iraq and Syria, and this time go to war in Syria against the side that's against Assad. So within a year's time, he had flipped who was the worst of two evils in Syria. So yes, I think there's a rush into it. And again, what we're talking about, or again, very much like the Bush administration, there's a lot of semantics, there's a lot of rhetoric, There's a lot of romantic language about how justified we've been or how noble our actions have been. But when you look at the sacrifices our troops have endured and actually the results, you see the situation in the Middle East gets worse and worse each year. Pretty much every month it seems to get worse and worse. You do have to scratch your head. And,
well, let's talk about that, because there are many costs of war, most notably the lives destroyed on both sides, and then, of course, the costs associated with destroying them. At the end of the day, the American taxpayer is paying for the bullets that we fire and the bombs that we drop, as well as the ongoing medical expenses to support our troops when they return. Break down the costs for us in lives and dollars. Did Obama ignore these facts in his speech?
Oh, it's amazing. And it's just not President Obama. It's both parties. I can't imagine, finding an elected public official who speaks openly about the cost of these wars. It just, with a few exceptions, say a Jim McGovern or a Walter Jones in the House of Representatives, there's not many who speak about these costs. But in terms of people, in terms of lives, on the American side, as many people know, we've had 6,000 service members killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, about 50,000 physically wounded. What most people don't know is that at least 2 Iraq and Afghanistan veterans are killing themselves each day. So when you do the math, you quickly figure out that more Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have killed themselves since coming home from Iraq than were killed by any enemy in combat overseas. We also know from a 2013 study by the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America that 30% of Iraq and Afghan veterans have contemplated suicide. From the Department of Veterans Affairs and Department of Defense, we know the number of traumatic brain injuries number into hundreds of thousands, as well as the diagnosed cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, moral injury. Same thing in the cases of the hundreds of thousands. And this is par for the course. This is nothing that should be new to anyone in a position of responsibility of the cost of war, but it certainly is ignored by each generation of leadership I think we have in this country. Fiscally, the numbers are nearly as daunting, particularly for an economy that's struggling like ours, for a middle class that hasn't seen a wage increase in several decades. You're looking at costs, direct costs for the wars in Iraq, the cost for the bullets, the fuel, the food for our troops, to have been $1.6 trillion and counting. That's just a direct cost of the wars. When you add in all the other indirect costs of the wars, when you add in the interest payments, which, as a note, the interest we've spent on these wars so far has been $270 billion.
Who are we paying the interest to?
Just in the interest, $270 billion, yeah.
Who are we paying the interest to?
Oh, it's basically as if we're paying this on the credit card. So a lot of it is to ourselves, the way our government borrows from itself, but it's also the way our government borrows from other nations, most notably and most prolifically and publicly, China. So we're basically paying for these wars on a credit card, and the costs continue to mount. One of the things about the costs of war is, just as with the human cost in terms of soldiers who go overseas, and the old adage from Plato that only the dead have seen the end of war. Well, fiscally, it's the same way. According to Harvard University, we're looking at costs in our lifetimes of up to $6 trillion for the Iraq and Afghan wars.
That's a staggering figure. That's a staggering figure.
And one more number to break it out, and it's just not just these wars. It's been our policy for decades now. Princeton University crunched the numbers, and since 1979, when Jimmy Carter said the Persian Gulf is a national security interest or a vital interest for the United States of America, we have spent $10 trillion policing the Persian Gulf. And you have to sit and read the headlines from today, from yesterday. We know what the headlines are going to be tomorrow about more chaos, more violence, more death in the Middle East, and you have to say, what has this gotten?
Well, let's talk about those headlines we'll see tomorrow. We're entering into the presidential election season. Politicians are beginning to hone their stump speeches. Obama has 2 more years in office. During these next 2 years, do you think Obama will be able to tie up these conflicts with a nice bow and bring our troops home to their families? Or do you see this playing out as some senior officials in the Obama administration have stated, that this limitless war will run for another decade or 2?
I certainly don't see anything to make me think it's going to be the former. I think it's going to be the latter. I think we are in perpetual war. I think you have got a machine in place. We spend $1 trillion a year on our national security, on our intelligence, on our veterans, on our homeland security, on our State Department, on our intelligence, right, on our interest payments. $1 trillion a year. That's a mighty beast. That is a Leviathan. And how do you turn that off? As well as these wars in the Middle East, they've all entered into these incredible cycles of violence. Afghanistan is probably the best example, where it's been going on for 4 decades. And so as we continue to add more troops to these wars, as we add more money, another statistic to throw at your viewers, the United States provides 76% of the world's weapons. There's no incentive to end these wars, and also too, the possibility of ending them becomes less and less as that cycle of violence in these wars continues to spin. Well,
Randolph Bourne said of World War I that war is the health of the state. And given the economic instability of the world, quantitative easing from the Federal Reserve, and now, of course, the European Central Bank is scheduled to inject $1.1 trillion into the Eurozone. You just mentioned that, we're paying for these wars on a credit card with paying interest to the Chinese. How long can the American people and the people of the world endure this endless war?
American people right now seem to be pretty secluded from it. Most of them don't know people who've served over there. They're not certainly feeling the human factors. Everyone knows the 1% number of that's how many Americans have served in these wars. So most people are excluded personally. But at some point, the American public has to realize that we are putting our priority, we are putting our emphasis, we are putting our future in these wars. This is what the priority of our country is. The priority of our elected leaders are to continue pushing money to these wars and finding justifications or rationales to continue these wars. I mean, when you're spending $1 trillion a year on national security, what happens is a whole cottage industry, that's a bad term because it's a massive industry actually, exists to support that $1 trillion a year. So you have all these academics, you have these think tanks, the money goes into the campaign system, and you really do see that this as a system that, how do you break? How do you, without some type of cataclysm? And that's what scares me the most, is that you go back and you look at Europe pre-World War I, how militaristic they were, how nationalist they were, how they engaged. They started that war in Europe for really no purpose when you go back and look at it. And then you see that it took them 2 world wars to break that cycle of militarism and nationalism. And you wonder, what's it going to take in this country for us to do the same, for us to basically realize that we are spending our way into oblivion, and we are also sacrificing any moral authority or any moral virtues we may have by continuing and escalating these wars.
All right, Matthew, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
That was journalist and veteran Matthew Hoh. You can find out more about him at MatthewHoh.com. Up next, we've got today's special report, and Amanda Gabriel is standing by with your daily digital report.